December 1941. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, America entered a war it was not yet ready to fight. Battleships lay smoking in the harbor. Airfields were wrecked. The Pacific Fleet, once the symbol of American reach, and was crippled in a single morning. Yet amid the chaos, one branch of the Navy still stood almost untouched: the submarine force. Dozens of sleek diesel-powered boats, Gatos, Tambors, and Sargos waited in Pacific harbors, engines ready. To the admirals in Washington, these subs became America's sharpest surviving weapon. They carried the Navy's newest technological pride, the Mark 14 torpedo. It was supposed to be a marvel of modern design, faster, smarter, and deadlier than any weapon before it. Years of laboratory testing and bureaucratic confidence stood behind it. The weapons maker, the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance, BUORD, had promised perfection, but on the front lines, that promise was about to collapse. In early 1942, American submarines were given a clear order: sink everything flying a Japanese flag. It was the start of a campaign to strangle Japan's shipping, to cut the empire's lifelines of oil, food, and steel. With their aircraft carriers recovering from Pearl Harbor, submarines were expected to carry the burden of vengeance. But soon after those first patrols began, troubling reports trickled in. Torpedoes missed easy targets. Others struck, only to thud harmlessly against hulls or detonate before reaching them. At first, headquarters dismissed these as operator error. Admirals and ordnance engineers believed their weapons couldn't be wrong, not after years of controlled testing. The Bureau of Ordnance had spent millions perfecting the Mark 14. It was, they insisted, the most reliable torpedo ever built. But the reports didn't stop. From the Java Sea, Makassar Strait, and Bismarck Archipelago, submarine skippers kept sending the same message: multiple duds, premature explosions, targets unharmed. The tone of their war patrol reports changed, and from hopeful to angry, then to something darker: disbelief. The Mark 14 had been designed through the 1930s under tight budgets and strict secrecy. Its creators envisioned a self-propelled underwater missile with a 5,000-yard range, a 500-pound warhead, and a top speed of 46 knots. It used compressed air and alcohol-fueled steam turbines for propulsion, a technological marvel of its era. More importantly, it carried two revolutionary features: the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, designed to detect the magnetic field of a ship's hull and detonate beneath it, creating a shockwave that would break a ship's back. The contact exploder, a mechanical firing pin that would trigger the warhead on direct impact. On paper, this made it the most advanced torpedo in the world, capable of destroying ships with a single strike. But what the Bureau's tests never revealed was that their perfect weapon had never been tested under real war conditions. The test ranges used calm, shallow water. The torpedoes were fired at stationary targets, often with dummy warheads. Depth, salinity, magnetic variation, all the unpredictable variables of the open Pacific, were absent. The Bureau trusted equations over experience, and now real war was revealing every flaw. Inside those steel tubes hundreds of feet below the surface, American sailors were learning a bitter lesson. They had risked their lives to line up a perfect attack, a task that required nerves of ice and minute calculations of bearing, distance, and speed. To have that effort betrayed by a weapon that didn't work was devastating. Commanders began to doubt themselves. Some ran repeated tests during patrols, firing at cliffs or at captured enemy barges to confirm what their instincts already knew. The torpedoes ran too deep and often failed to explode. Lieutenant Commander Tyrell D. Jacobs of the USS Sargo recorded firing 4 torpedoes at a stationary ship. Each passed harmlessly beneath the hull. Others, like Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton, would risk court-martial by publicly accusing the Bureau of negligence. But official Washington refused to listen. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted that the torpedoes were fine. The captains, they claimed, were not using them correctly. The disconnect between the shore and the sea was growing, and so was the anger. By mid-1942, the U.S. Navy's submarine campaign was faltering. While submariners hunted convoys across thousands of miles of ocean, they were fighting two enemies: the Japanese Navy above and the broken torpedoes below. Some commanders, frustrated and disillusioned, began altering their own weapons. They disabled the magnetic exploders with improvised tools, hoping the contact detonators would do better. But even then, the results were erratic. Many risked reprimand just to make their torpedoes less smart. For every Japanese ship sunk, 2 or 3 escaped because of faulty weapons. Statistically, through most of 1942, American submarines were firing up to 7 torpedoes for every confirmed kill. The cost was not only in lost steel, but in lost faith. Crews started to refer to the Mark 14 with bitter nicknames: the one that got away, the Dudfish, and the Bureau Special. Behind those nicknames lay a quiet despair. In warfare, trust in your weapon is sacred. Once that trust breaks, so does the fighting spirit. Yet the Bureau of Ordnance continued to dismiss every complaint. In their offices in Washington and Newport, Rhode Island, officers in starched uniforms reviewed reports and wrote replies filled with technical jargon and polite disbelief. To them, it was inconceivable that their design could fail. But across the Pacific, young men in steel coffins knew the truth, and they were dying because no one would listen. By late 1942, the situation had reached a breaking point. Patrol reports were stacking up. Losses were mounting. The Pacific Submarine Command needed a leader who would challenge the system itself. Enter Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood. Known among peers as brilliant but blunt, Lockwood had spent years commanding submarines and training crews. He understood both the science and the soul of undersea warfare. When he took command of Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, COMSUBPAC, his first concern wasn't tactics and it was torpedoes. Lockwood listened to his captains. He read their angry, exhausted reports. And unlike the bureaucrats back home, he believed them. When told by the Bureau that the torpedoes are functioning perfectly, Lockwood reportedly muttered, "If that's true, then there's something wrong with our entire Pacific Ocean." He wasn't exaggerating. For Lockwood, the math didn't add up. The statistics of failed detonations, the first-hand testimonies, the mounting frustration, all pointed to a deeper systemic problem. But to prove it, he'd have to take on the most powerful and arrogant institution in the Navy, the Bureau of Ordnance itself. And that confrontation was about to become one of the fiercest internal battles of World War II. The heart of the crisis lay not in the ocean, but in the quiet offices and test ranges of the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance, the institution responsible for every torpedo, gun, and shell in the fleet. For years, BUORD had operated with an almost religious confidence in its procedures. Every new weapon passed its controlled trials. Every report confirmed its mechanical perfection. On paper, the Navy's torpedo program was flawless. In reality, it was blind. In peacetime America of the 1930s, budgets were tight and secrecy was king. Torpedoes were expensive, roughly $10,000 apiece, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. The Bureau considered live fire testing too costly and wasteful. Instead, engineers ran dry launches or retrieved torpedoes after dummy runs. Most were never detonated in real conditions. They had tested for precision, not for reliability under war. It was a dangerous assumption. The Mark 14's internal systems were exquisitely complex. Its depth control mechanism relied on a hydrostatic valve and pendulum balance, instruments easily thrown off by temperature, salinity, and pressure. Its Mark 6 magnetic exploder was calibrated for Earth's magnetic field near Newport, Rhode Island, not for the vastly different magnetic intensities of the equatorial Pacific. Even the contact exploder, a simple firing pin meant to crush on impact, was made of hardened steel so strong that it sometimes bent instead of triggering when striking at high speed. None of this was known to BUORD, because the Bureau had never tested the weapon under real conditions. The first true battlefield tests were being conducted not by engineers, but by submariners risking their lives thousands of miles from home. As more failures were reported, BUORD's responses followed a familiar pattern. Each time a submarine captain complained, the Bureau blamed crew error, improper maintenance skill, or incorrect depth setting. When officers demanded live fire tests, they were told there was no need. In March 1942, Rear Admiral Ralph Waldo Christie, one of the torpedo's original architects and head of the Newport Torpedo Station, defended the Mark 14 passionately. Christie was a technical genius, but he was also emotionally tied to his creation. He refused to believe his design could be flawed. Ironically, he would later command submarines in the field and witness the failures firsthand. But at this stage, he was still the staunchest defender of Buord's reputation. The Bureau's institutional arrogance hardened into policy. Admitting the weapon was faulty would mean admitting years of wasted research, millions in misallocated funds, and negligence in war readiness. So they didn't admit it. They silenced it. Submarine commanders were ordered to cease unauthorized modifications and to trust their equipment. For crews who had watched torpedoes bounce off enemy hulls, those orders were worse than insulting. They were deadly. Throughout 1942, the war on paper grew just as fierce as the war at sea. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, was reading through thick folders of submarine patrol summaries. He saw the same story repeated. Multiple misses on stationary target. Explosions premature at 300, 400 yards. Detonations failed on contact. To senior commanders like Nimitz and Lockwood, this wasn't coincidence, it was systemic. Lockwood began collecting first-hand evidence from returning captains. Some, like Commander Creed Burlingame of the USS Silversides, brought back photos and physical fragments of torpedoes that had struck without exploding. Others fired test shots at cliffs or empty barges to prove the weapons ran 10 to 15 feet deeper than their dials. Indicated, each piece of evidence chipped away at the Bureau's story, but the Navy's internal bureaucracy moved slowly, like a ship turning against the current. By the end of 1942, the U.S. submarine force had fired over 1,500 torpedoes in combat. Fewer than a quarter had produced confirmed sinkings. The rest, nearly 1,200 weapons, either missed, detonated early, or failed entirely. The implications were staggering. At that stage of the war, Japan's merchant fleet was still over 6 million tons strong. Every failed attack meant more supplies reaching Tokyo, more fuel reaching the Imperial Navy, more ammunition reaching the jungles of Guadalcanal. The submariners called it fighting with blanks. And each dud wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a moral wound, Lockwood later wrote, that the look on a crew's face after a dud was like watching faith itself break. Something had to be done. But the Bureau's testing facilities were in the United States, and they refused to repeat full-scale experiments. So Lockwood began to plan his own, thousands of miles from Washington, without permission. In early 1943, Lockwood transferred from Australia to Pearl Harbor as commander, submarine force, Pacific Fleet. Now he had authority, and he was determined to use it. The first step was data. He ordered a full statistical review of torpedo performance, comparing reports across every patrol zone, from the South China Sea to the Aleutians. The results were irrefutable. Across hundreds of documented shots, failures followed a consistent pattern. Torpedoes ran deep, magnetic exploders triggered prematurely, and impact detonators misfired on direct hits. Then came the second step, proof. Lockwood approved a secret, unauthorized testing program at Hawaiian test ranges. Crews fired live war shots, fully armed torpedoes, at cliff faces and target barges, recording depth tracks with underwater microphones and pressure gauges. Every test confirmed what the submariners had been saying for months. Torpedoes were running an average of 11 feet deeper than set. Magnetic exploders were detonating far too early, often before reaching the target's magnetic field. The contact exploder's firing pin bent on impact when striking a target head-on. For the first time, the failure had measurable evidence, but Lockwood knew that raw data wouldn't be enough. The Bureau of Ordnance had ignored field reports. They could easily ignore these too. To force change, he'd need something undeniable, something the Bureau couldn't explain away. He'd need to embarrass them with the truth. The confrontation brewing between Lockwood and Buord was more than a technical dispute. It was a cultural one. The Bureau was an engineering establishment shaped by decades of peacetime tradition. They prized precision, hierarchy, and procedure. Lockwood represented a new kind of leadership, blunt, impatient, shaped by the urgency of real combat. To Buord, Lockwood was a reckless field officer undermining authority. To Lockwood, Buord was a bureaucracy willing to sacrifice sailors to protect its pride. Letters and telegrams flew back and forth, technical memos laced with veiled frustration. Each side accused the other of misinterpretation of data. But beneath the language of engineers and admirals was a simple human conflict: ego versus accountability. In Washington, officers dismissed Lockwood as that mad admiral in the Pacific. In Pearl Harbor, sailors began calling him Uncle Charlie, the man who finally listened. It was a rare kind of loyalty born from shared anger. By the spring of 1943, Lockwood's resolve hardened into obsession. He could no longer rely on reports or partial tests. He wanted a full-scale, irrefutable live-fire demonstration, one that would expose the torpedo's failures in front of witnesses. He gathered his staff at Pearl Harbor and told them plainly, "We're going to fire these damn things until they work, or we prove, beyond doubt, that they don't." It was a declaration of war within his own Navy, one that would pit frontline sailors against their own weapons, bureau, and push the limits of discipline, science, and courage. The investigation that followed would uncover not one, but 3 separate design failures buried beneath years of denial, and it would force the U.S. Navy to confront its own complacency at the height of World War II. By 1943, the battle over America's broken torpedoes had split the Navy along invisible lines: those who believed the reports from the front and those who refused to. But to understand what this crisis meant, you have to look not at charts or memos, but at the men inside those submarines. In the tight metal corridors of a World War II submarine, everything depended on trust. Trust in the captain's orders, trust in the machinery that kept the sea out, and above all, trust in the weapon they carried, the torpedo. When that trust broke, something fundamental inside the crews broke with it. Imagine it: 40 men trapped in a steel cylinder 300 feet below the surface. Hearing the creaks of pressure and the hum of machinery, they risked their lives for a single perfect firing solution. Hours of tracking, calculating, and closing on a target that could destroy them if it spotted them first. Then they fire, and the weapon fails. There is no sound more devastating than silence when you expect an explosion. Sailors began to dread the words, "Fire 1." They had seen torpedoes curve off course, explode too early, or strike a ship without effect. After one attack, a captain wrote, "I could almost hear the laughter of the Japanese bridge crew as our torpedo bounced away." Some crews grew superstitious. They marked torpedoes with chalked prayers or nicknames. Others handled them like cursed relics. It wasn't uncommon for men to refer to a weapon as a liar. In mess rooms, anger simmered quietly. Officers wrote letters they never sent. Letters blaming Washington for their lost friends and wasted courage. Every dude was not just a mechanical failure. It was a betrayal. For the submariners, this was no longer about tactics or statistics. It was personal. They had done everything right. They had risked everything. And yet their weapon refused to fight for them. To understand the magnitude of the problem, you have to see it through the eyes of a submarine commander trying to win an unwinnable war. A submarine's power lies in surprise. It has one moment to strike before the enemy realizes it's there. A single successful hit could turn the tide of a patrol. But when your weapon cannot be trusted, that moment vanishes. Commanders had to adapt. They began to fire larger spreads, 4, sometimes 6 torpedoes, hoping at least one would detonate. That meant fewer attacks per patrol, fewer chances to sink targets, and more risk of exposure as enemy escorts closed in after missed shots. The Japanese Navy quickly learned that American torpedoes were unreliable. Merchant captains began taking bolder routes, assuming that even if struck, they might survive. Destroyers started counterattacking aggressively after dud hits, dropping depth charges until submarines were forced to dive deep and retreat. The psychological balance shifted. Instead of hunters, U.S. submarines were becoming prey. Captain Tyrell Jacobs, frustrated beyond patience, once surfaced his submarine after a failed attack and fired his deck gun at a torpedo still floating on the surface. It sank without exploding, a grim metaphor for the entire campaign. The tactical cost was enormous. Every dud extended the war. Every miss meant fuel, food, and ammunition continued to reach the Japanese front lines. The Mark 14's failure didn't just weaken U.S. submarines. It undermined one of the few strategies the Navy had left in 1942, economic strangulation. But there was another consequence, quieter and harder to measure: the erosion of discipline through doubt. Doctrine says a submarine must fire and dive immediately, but many captains began staying at periscope depth after firing, waiting to confirm hits. That hesitation often cost them their lives. In the confined logic of undersea warfare, even a second of doubt could be fatal. Submarine captains were a unique breed, fiercely independent, analytical, and unflinchingly brave. But by late 1942, they were caught between duty and rebellion. To obey orders meant to trust the Bureau's claim that the torpedoes were fine. To save their men meant to break that trust and modify the weapons themselves. Some chose loyalty to reason over loyalty to command. They deactivated the Mark VI magnetic exploder. With pocket tools and field improvisation, they changed depth settings manually, often firing at shallower depths than prescribed, hoping the torpedo would run deep enough to hit. These field modifications were technically illegal, acts of defiance, but they were also acts of survival. Captains like Dudley Mush Morton and Howard Gilmore openly ignored directives and reported better results afterward. Lockwood quietly supported them. He understood that blind obedience had already cost too many lives. Still, every disobedient success widened the rift between the fleet and the Bureau. For Washington, these captains were loose cannons. For their crews, they were heroes. The Navy had never faced such internal division. A war fought not just against Japan, but against its own flawed machine. By the time Lockwood began his investigation, the submarine force was on the brink of losing faith entirely. Some officers considered the Mark XIV more dangerous to its crew than to the enemy. In post-patrol interviews, one captain summarized the despair bluntly. "The enemy isn't what scares us. It's the thought of hitting a ship dead center and watching the torpedo just vanish." Statistically, American submarines were achieving less than 1/5 of their expected kill rate. The cost in morale was unquantifiable. Commanders questioned intelligence reports, training manuals, and even their own eyesight. Lockwood understood something few others did. Morale is a weapon too. And in the Pacific of 1943, that weapon was dangerously close to breaking. He needed to give his men hope, not through words, but through action. By proving once and for all that the fault lay not with them, but with the torpedoes themselves. The human and tactical toll of the Mark XIV disaster had reached its peak. But beneath those failures lay something even deeper, an engineering mystery and a leadership confrontation that would soon explode into open conflict between the front lines and Washington. Every war produces its share of flawed machines, but few in history betrayed their makers as deeply as the Mark XIV torpedo. On paper, it was a masterpiece, a 20-foot steel cylinder of American ingenuity. It ran faster, deeper, and farther than any torpedo before it. It could travel over 4,500 yards at nearly 46 knots guided by gyroscopic precision, and with the new Mark VI magnetic exploder, it promised to detonate beneath an enemy ship, breaking its keel in a single devastating strike. In theory, it was the perfect weapon. In practice, it was a disaster born of overconfidence. The Bureau of Ordnance, known simply as BUORD, had spent millions developing the Mark XIV but conducted minimal live-fire testing. Real torpedoes were expensive, and the Navy was under pressure to expand quickly. So they tested few, and tested them under perfect controlled conditions. Calm seas, static targets, shallow depths. The torpedo never faced the chaos of war before being declared combat-ready. When reports from the field began flooding in, duds, premature explosions, and misses, Board's engineers insisted it was user error. They argued that submarine captains were misaiming, or that their data was wrong. They were wrong. Later tests, conducted under Lockwood's orders, would reveal that the Mark XIV had 3 independent flaws, any one of which could make it fail. Depth control failure. Torpedoes ran an average of 10-15 feet deeper than their settings. Magnetic exploder malfunction. It detonated prematurely, triggered by variations in the Earth's magnetic field. Contact exploder weakness. Even when the torpedo struck perfectly, the firing pin often jammed or broke. It was a weapon that lied, telling commanders it would kill when it would not. BUORD's arrogance magnified the damage. They had believed so strongly in their invention that they dismissed all evidence to the contrary. The result was not just mechanical failure. It was institutional blindness. Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood was not the kind of man who backed down easily. Beneath his calm demeanor was a core of unshakable resolve, a commander who believed the truth was worth fighting for, even against his own navy. When he took command of the Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, SubPac, in early 1943, Lockwood inherited chaos. Dozens of patrol reports told the same story. Good shots, bad results. Washington's response was cold and bureaucratic. Lockwood's was furious and personal. He demanded hard evidence. If Buord would not test the torpedoes properly, he would. He ordered submarines to conduct live tests, firing Mark 14s against the cliffs of Kahulawe Island, Hawaii. When the torpedoes exploded prematurely or failed to detonate at all, Lockwood didn't just note the failures. He filmed them. Then he sent the results directly to the Bureau. The reaction in Washington was explosive. Lockwood had embarrassed one of the Navy's most powerful institutions. He was accused of undermining confidence and disobeying testing protocols, but he refused to back down. In one legendary statement, he declared, "If the Bureau doesn't believe the reports from our submarines, then I'll take one of those damn torpedoes, put it under their building in Washington, and set it off myself." It wasn't bluster, and it was exhaustion. Years of field reports had been ignored while men died doing everything right. For Lockwood, this was no longer a technical dispute. It was a moral one. His defiance marked a turning point in the Navy's culture. The first time operational commanders openly challenged the authority of their own weapons, designers, and for the first time in the war, the truth began to win. While the Americans wrestled with self-inflicted sabotage, the Japanese Navy reaped the benefits. Their torpedoes, the Type 93 Long Lance, were years ahead of anything the U.S. possessed. Fueled by oxygen rather than compressed air, they left no visible wake and had an unmatched range of up to 40 kilometers. In the early years of the war, they devastated Allied ships across the Pacific. Japanese submarine commanders, meanwhile, noted something strange. American torpedoes rarely detonated effectively. They began to factor it into their tactics. If hit, they often held their course, assuming the damage would be minimal. If they spotted an American submarine, they knew the odds favored them. In their logs, Japanese officers occasionally mocked the Mark 14's failures, calling it the sleeping fish. The irony was bitter. The U.S. Navy, whose industrial might could outbuild any opponent, was losing underwater battles not to superior tactics, but to its own complacency. But the Japanese advantage had a flaw of its own. Their faith in the Long Lance led them to underestimate the resilience and ingenuity of their American counterparts. Once the U.S. fixed its weapon, that imbalance would vanish, and the Pacific would become a death trap for Japanese shipping. In the end, the torpedo crisis was not just a story about engineering. It was about truth, and the courage to face it. Wars are often won not just by those who build the best machines, but by those willing to admit when their machines are broken. The Bureau of Ordnance clung to pride. Lockwood and his captains clung to proof. Between them stood thousands of lives and the outcome of an entire theater of war. In the bureaucratic language of the Navy, the Mark 14 was a technical issue, but in reality, it was a human wound, one that exposed how systems built on secrecy and hierarchy can fail the very people they're meant to protect. Lockwood's defiance wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was faith that truth once proven would save lives. And soon his persistence would collide with undeniable evidence because the tests he ordered, those that Washington wanted stopped, were about to reveal the shocking truth about America's most trusted weapon. The questions had been asked. The data had been gathered. Now came the moment of reckoning, when the truth would surface and the tide of war would finally turn. It began quietly. A calm morning on the waters off Kahulawe Island, Hawaii. The sea was flat, the sky washed pale by the rising sun. Onshore, small crews had gathered near the cliffs, the same cliffs that had seen years of naval testing. But this test was different. This one would expose the truth. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood stood watching as the submarine USS Muskelung, SS-262, prepared to fire a live Mark 14 torpedo. No dummy warhead, no practice run. This would be the real thing. He had ordered the test against the advice of Washington. They wanted reports. He wanted proof. The submarine's crew loaded the torpedo. The mechanism hissed, the outer door opened, and with a sudden flash of white bubbles, the Mark 14 streaked toward the island's face. Seconds passed. Then of an explosion, too early, too weak. Lockwood's face tightened. He turned to his officers and said quietly, "Fire another." The second torpedo ran straight and true, then struck the cliff and failed to detonate at all. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion could have been. They fired again. Same result. By the end of the test series, Lockwood had his answer. The torpedoes were running too deep, and even when they hit, the contact exploders often failed. The Mark 14's great secret was now undeniable. It was a flawed weapon from the start. The findings shocked even the most hardened officers. Lockwood's team, assisted by ordnance engineers stationed in Pearl Harbor, began tearing the torpedoes apart piece by piece. They found a pattern. The depth mechanisms, small bronze bellows meant to sense pressure, were calibrated in peacetime testing tanks, not real ocean conditions. The denser saltwater of the Pacific meant the torpedoes consistently ran deeper than indicated. For years, American captains had been setting their torpedoes for 10 feet, believing they'd strike a ship's hull. In reality, they were passing harmlessly 15 feet beneath. It was not incompetence. It was physics, miscalculated, untested, and ignored. Lockwood sent the results to the Bureau of Ordnance. Their response was stunningly bureaucratic. They suggested the submariners were mishandling their instruments, so Lockwood did something even bolder. He ordered his men to rig neutral buoyancy tests, firing torpedoes with dummy warheads and letting them travel under controlled observation. Using improvised gear and rough surface markers, they charted depth accuracy. The results confirmed everything. The Mark 14 wasn't just off by inches, it was off by yards. Still, Washington hesitated. They accepted minor adjustments but refused to acknowledge deeper flaws in the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, the component that was supposed to trigger under a ship's magnetic field. That's when Lockwood decided to test that too. The Mark 6 magnetic exploder was designed to be the Navy's great equalizer, a device that would detonate when it sensed the shift in magnetic flux beneath an enemy ship, shattering its keel. But it had never been tested in combat conditions. Lockwood's engineers, led by Ordnance Specialist Captain Ralph Christie, conducted real-world experiments. They fired torpedoes with live magnetic exploders under varying latitudes and field strengths. The results were catastrophic. The torpedoes detonated prematurely, sometimes halfway to the target, triggered not by a ship but by the Earth's magnetic field itself. The problem was built into the design. The weapon was too sensitive, calibrated for polar magnetic conditions but not for tropical ones. It meant that every submarine in the Pacific was fighting with a bomb that could betray them at any moment. For Lockwood, this was the breaking point. He ordered the complete deactivation of magnetic exploders across the Pacific Fleet, directly contradicting Bureau orders. When Washington protested, he replied simply, "We are here to sink ships, not to protect theories." His decision changed everything. Late that summer, the submarine USS Tenosa, SS-283 under Lieutenant Commander L.R. Daspit, encountered a Japanese tanker, the Tonin Maru No. 3, near Truk Lagoon. It was a golden target, massive, unescorted, and worth tens of thousands of tons. Daspit executed a textbook attack. 2 torpedoes struck one but failed to detonate. He fired again, more duds. 8 perfect hits, 8 failures. Enraged, Daspit surfaced his submarine, retrieved one of the spent torpedoes, and brought it back to Pearl Harbor as evidence. Lockwood examined it personally. The contact exploder's firing pin was bent. The impact had driven it sideways instead of forward. The weapon had hit too hard. The very design meant to make it lethal had made it useless. Lockwood ordered the exploder mechanism redesigned immediately, replacing fragile internal components with sturdier firing pins. The Bureau objected again, but the results spoke for themselves. By the fall of 1943, submarines using modified torpedoes began reporting consistent detonations. Targets that had survived multiple patrols were now sinking in minutes. The morale within the fleet surged. The Mark 14, once cursed, was finally doing what it was meant to do. When Lockwood's full report reached Washington, The Bureau of Ordnance could no longer ignore the evidence. 3 separate flaws, each confirmed through field testing, all pointing to one undeniable truth. The Mark 14 torpedo, the Navy's most trusted weapon, had been unfit for combat since the first day of the war. The official tone of Buord's reply was subdued, almost embarrassed. They promised adjustments and issued new instructions, but among the submarine crews, there was no celebration, only grim vindication. For 2 years they had fought blind, losing comrades and missions because of a failure that should have been prevented long before Pearl Harbor. Lockwood's investigation didn't just fix a torpedo. It exposed the cost of silence, how institutional pride could be deadlier than any enemy fleet. And yet, for all the frustration and loss, the moment the Mark 14 was fixed marked the rebirth of America's undersea war. Because now, for the first time, every torpedo that left a submarine's tube carried not doubt, but certainty. The Mark 14 had been repaired, recalibrated, and redeemed. But the war was not over, and neither was Lockwood's fight. Ahead lay the true test, proving that these corrected weapons could turn the tide of the Pacific and erase 2 years of failure in a single decisive campaign. Summer, 1943. The Pacific was burning and changing. In every theater, American submarines began to go back on patrol. But this time something was different. The old fear had faded. The whispers about cursed torpedoes were gone. Each boat now carried weapons modified under Lockwood's direct supervision. New depth settings, strengthened exploders, and the magnetic triggers permanently disabled. The submariners weren't just armed, they were avenged. And the enemy, who had grown accustomed to surviving those once silent attacks, was about to face the reckoning. The submarine USS Bowfin, SS-287, departed from Fremantle, Australia on a humid August night. Her captain, Commander Walter Griffith, was among the first to carry the fixed Mark 14s into enemy waters. On the 7th day, Bowfin sighted a Japanese convoy near the Makassar Strait, 3 freighters escorted by 2 destroyers. Griffith ordered silent running. Depth 60 feet. Bearing perfect. Distance 200 yards. He fired 4 torpedoes. Moments later, the ocean erupted. 2 direct hits tore into a Japanese transport, blowing her boilers apart. Griffith's crew erupted in restrained cheers. For the first time in 2 years, their weapons had struck true. When the submarine returned to base, Griffith radioed one line to Lockwood's headquarters: "New fish bite hard." Across the fleet, similar reports began pouring in. By the end of 1943, the U.S. Navy's undersea campaign had turned into a precision war of attrition. Submarines that once returned home with empty logs now came back with confirmed kills. The results were measurable and staggering. In 1942, U.S. submarines sank 180,000 tons of Japanese shipping. In 1943, after the torpedo corrections, that number jumped to nearly 1.5 million tons. The difference wasn't strategy. It was truth. Lockwood's men, armed with functioning weapons, began to dismantle Japan's maritime empire piece by piece. Tankers, transports, freighters, all targets that had once escaped now vanished beneath the waves. Japan's wartime economy, already strained by American air raids and island losses, began to starve. Coal, oil, and steel could no longer move freely between the home islands and the conquered territories. Factories slowed. Fleets waited for fuel that never came. And the silent killers beneath the sea, the once doubted submariners, became legends. Lockwood watched the transformation with quiet pride. He had risked his career, defied Washington, and faced months of bureaucratic hostility, all for this moment. Each new report from the front confirmed it had been worth it. In his diary, he wrote, "The old fish are finally fighting for us, not against us." Still, the victory was not without ghosts. He knew what the price had been. Dozens of submarines lost in 1942. Hundreds of sailors who had gone to their deaths firing defective torpedoes. The triumph could not erase that cost, but it could honor it. Every ship sunk now carried the weight of the men who had died trying to prove the truth. Lockwood ordered a memorial placed at Pearl Harbor for the lost boats. Each name etched into stone represented not just sacrifice, but vindication. Back in Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance faced a reckoning of its own. Their earlier arrogance had been exposed in the starkest possible way. The front lines had fixed what the scientists could not. In official correspondence, Buord tried to shift credit quietly, praising cooperative field testing. But within the Navy, everyone knew what had happened. Lockwood had been right. The field had forced the truth upon the bureaucracy. Behind closed doors, procedures changed. Live fire testing became mandatory. Designs were reevaluated under combat conditions. No longer would a weapon be approved solely on theoretical data. It was one of the quiet revolutions of the war, the end of blind faith in the laboratory, and the birth of the Navy's modern doctrine of empirical testing. By 1944, the Pacific's undersea war had reached full fury. Submarines like the USS Tang, USS Wahoo, and USS Harder tore through convoys with mathematical precision. The once invincible Japanese shipping network was crumbling. Fewer than 50 submarines, barely 2% of the U.S. Navy's manpower, were now responsible for destroying over half of Japan's merchant fleet. It was a campaign so devastating that even Admiral Yamamoto, before his death, acknowledged it privately. The unseen enemy is the one we can no longer fight. Every explosion on the horizon was a vindication of Lockwood's defiance. Every burning freighter was proof that truth, once freed from denial, could become a weapon mightier than pride. By late 1944, the transformation was complete. The American submarine force had gone from a frustrated, doubting fleet to one of the most lethal strike groups in history. The numbers told the story. 1,000,000 tons of Japanese shipping destroyed by war's end, enemy vessels sunk, and the once broken Mark 14, now fully corrected, accounted for the vast majority of those kills. The same torpedo that had once symbolized failure became the instrument of Japan's economic collapse. It was more than a technological redemption. It was poetic justice. When the war finally drew to its close, Admiral Lockwood was asked how he wanted to be remembered. He didn't speak of ranks or decorations. He spoke of his men. They fought not just the enemy, he said, but the blindness of their own navy. And they won both wars. For the submariners, those words meant everything. They had endured the humiliation of failure, the fear of betrayal, and the slow erosion of faith. But through persistence and the courage to question, they had reclaimed their honor. The Pacific was silent again now. No depth charges, no convoys, no radio cries of torpedo in the water, just the long echo of what truth had cost and what it had achieved. The war had changed because one man refused to look away. But even victory carried its burden. Because when the shooting stopped, Lockwood and his generation were left with a question far heavier than steel or salt water. How had such a mistake lasted so long? The guns had fallen silent. The oceans that once carried the thunder of battle now reflected a fragile peace. But for Admiral Charles Lockwood and the men who had served beneath him, victory brought not relief, but reflection. The war was over, and the truth, finally undeniable, lay bare for all to see. The Mark 14 torpedo, once hailed as a marvel of American engineering, had failed its nation at the moment it was needed most, and the consequences of that failure were written in blood and steel across the Pacific seabed. In the official record books, the U.S. submarine campaign looked like a triumph, one of the most effective military operations in modern history. But buried behind those statistics was a deeper cost. 2 years of wasted effort, lost ships and dead crews. Between 1941 and mid-1943, at least 30 American submarines vanished during patrols where malfunctioning torpedoes had played a fatal role. Crews who should have returned home never surfaced again. Historians later estimated that the torpedo failures had prolonged the Pacific War by 6 to 9 months, costing thousands of additional Allied and Japanese lives. Every dude had not only spared an enemy ship, it had delayed the liberation of prisoners, the fall of occupied islands, and the end of suffering across Asia. Lockwood understood this better than anyone. For him, the numbers weren't just statistics. They were names. Faces. In the quiet hours after the war, he often walked the docks at Pearl Harbor, the same piers where his submarines had once departed, proud and unknowing. Now many of those boats existed only as names etched into bronze. Grunion, Pickerel, Perch, Runner, the ghosts of a fleet that had fought with broken weapons and unbroken courage. In 1945, as reports were compiled for post-war review, the Bureau of Ordnance faced a storm of internal scrutiny. Lockwood's documentation of the torpedo crisis was now part of the Navy's permanent historical record. No one could deny it anymore. The Bureau's resistance to field evidence had directly endangered the fleet. Yet in true bureaucratic fashion, accountability came quietly without public scandal. There were no trials, no dismissals with headlines. Instead, the Navy rewrote its procedures, an implicit confession that something fundamental had been broken. Every new weapon now required combat condition testing before approval. Live fire experiments became mandatory, and command structures were redesigned to allow operational feedback to challenge engineering decisions in real time. Lockwood's defiance had reshaped the Navy more deeply than any torpedo could have. He had turned institutional arrogance into institutional humility, at least for a while. For the men who had fought through the torpedo crisis, the emotional scars ran deep. Many captains who had commanded failed patrols carried lifelong guilt, believing they had let their crews down, only to learn years later that the fault had never been theirs. One retired commander, interviewed decades later, said quietly, "We thought we were missing. We thought we were the problem. Then Lockwood proved we were right all along. But by then, too many of us were gone." The revelation healed some wounds but reopened others. It forced veterans to revisit memories they had long buried. Moments of terror, of wasted courage, of watching a perfect shot fail in silence for some. Vindication came too late. In military academies across America, Lockwood's handling of the crisis became a case study in moral courage. He had faced a dilemma few leaders ever encounter: obeying flawed authority or protecting truth at all costs. He chose truth. It was not an easy choice. His letters from the period reveal moments of deep frustration, of sleepless nights spent arguing with superiors who refused to listen. But he understood a lesson every great commander must eventually learn. Loyalty to truth is loyalty to victory itself. That principle would echo through future generations of officers. When post-war commanders faced weapon failures in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, they invoked Lockwood's example as precedent, proof that questioning authority was not rebellion, but responsibility. In that sense, the torpedo crisis became more than a wartime episode. It became a parable of leadership. Despite the lessons learned, the shadow of Buord's failure lingered in the Navy for decades. Some officers who had defended the Bureau's testing procedures quietly retired. Others remained, reshaping their narratives to fit the new truth. Lockwood never pursued vengeance. He believed time would handle justice, and it did. In 1946, as part of the Navy's internal review, the Bureau of Ordnance was restructured and later replaced by the Bureau of Weapons, its authority diluted, its reputation forever marked. Few outside military circles ever knew the full story, but inside the service every submariner remembered. They knew that the cost of silence was measured not in dollars but in lives. The war had given Lockwood fame, but not comfort. He had won, but the victory had come too late for the men who had fought beside him. Still, he believed the truth had to be faced no matter how long it took. Because in war, denial is not a defense. It is another kind of enemy. The Pacific was rebuilding now. Ships lay rusting beneath its waters, and nations began to count their dead. But one truth had risen above the waves, a truth that would redefine how America built and believed in its weapons forever. The war was over. But the lessons it left behind would echo for generations, buried not in the depths of the Pacific, but in the conscience of the United States Navy. For Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, the struggle had never been about glory. It was about truth. And as peace settled over the Pacific, that truth began to reshape everything the Navy believed about its own machines, its systems, and its soul. When Japan formally surrendered in September 1945, the U.S. Navy began compiling its operational analysis. The numbers were staggering. American submarines had sunk more than 2,300 Japanese ships, totaling over 5 million tons of enemy shipping, roughly 55% of Japan's total maritime losses. That made the submarine campaign one of the deadliest and most decisive in military history. And yet those same reports revealed something darker. In the first 18 months of war, while submarines hunted tirelessly, more than half of their torpedoes had failed. Of every 10 fired, 5 had either exploded prematurely, missed entirely, or struck without detonating. Only after Lockwood's relentless campaign to expose the flaws, his tests, his defiance, his refusal to bow, did the fleet's true potential ignite. By late 1943, the once broken submarine force had transformed into a precision weapon of economic warfare. Merchant convoys vanished from the seas, Japan's oil lifelines were severed, and Lockwood's submariners, armed now with torpedoes that finally worked, became the silent hammer of the Pacific. After the war, Lockwood was promoted to Vice Admiral and appointed commander of the U.S. Pacific Submarine Force, a role that allowed him to oversee the very system he had once fought against. He turned the Pearl Harbor submarine base into a monument of progress and remembrance. He ordered the preservation of wartime logs, combat footage, and technical reports, not to glorify himself, but to ensure that future officers would never again trust untested weapons. In 1947, he retired from active duty. But retirement did not silence him. He wrote extensively. His book, Sink 'Em All in Hell at 50 Fathoms, offered raw insight into the courage and suffering of his men. He became a respected consultant on naval operations and submarine safety, warning repeatedly that bureaucratic complacency was a greater threat than any foreign enemy. Lockwood passed away in 1967. At his funeral, fellow admirals, former submarine captains, and wartime engineers stood in silent salute. No medals were spoken of. No victories were cited. Only one phrase was whispered among the ranks. He fought for the truth, and he won. The Mark 14's failure triggered an era of radical reform in American weapons development. Every new torpedo, missile, and bomb that followed was subjected to live, combat condition testing before ever being deployed. Engineers and commanders began working side by side, a partnership born from the pain of mistrust. By the 1950s, the U.S. Navy had developed new torpedo systems, the Mark 16, and later the Mark 37, both designed with redundant safety systems and simplified fuses that eliminated the magnetic detonation problem forever. Lockwood's legacy was embedded in every circuit, every explosive charge, every checklist. The doctrine of test before trust became naval gospel. The very culture that had once silenced frontline feedback now celebrated it. Commanders were encouraged to challenge design assumptions, report flaws, and question orders if evidence demanded it. It was a transformation that reached beyond weapons. It changed the Navy's identity. For surviving submariners, time offered perspective but not distance. The memories of duds, those haunting moments when perfect shots failed, never faded. Decades later, in reunions and veterans' halls, stories still circulated of ghost attacks, torpedoes that struck with a thud instead of a boom, or curved away at the last second. Men laughed about it now, but the laughter carried weight. Some boats that vanished early in the war were later found through deep-sea expeditions, like the USS Grunion, discovered in 2007 off the Aleutian Islands. The wreck showed signs that her own torpedo had malfunctioned, turning back toward the submarine. It was the ultimate symbol of the Mark 14's tragedy, a weapon so flawed it sometimes destroyed the very men who trusted it. Lockwood had once called such losses a sin of pride, disguised as science, and history would remember that phrase. By the late 20th century, historians and military scholars began viewing the torpedo crisis as a textbook study in institutional denial, how hierarchy and ego can blind even the most advanced nations to their own failures. In internal training lectures, the story of Admiral Lockwood became required reading for U.S. Navy engineering officers. It was no longer just about torpedoes. It was about the eternal struggle between truth and authority. The moral was simple. If you cannot question your weapons, you cannot win your wars. Today, the Pacific Ocean remains a vast graveyard of steel and sacrifice. More than 50 American submarines lie entombed beneath its waves, silent witnesses to the torpedo crisis and the men who fought through it. Each one tells a different story, but together they whisper the same truth. Progress is written in the language of error. Lockwood's victory was not just mechanical, it was moral. He had proven that courage isn't always found in combat. Sometimes it's found in standing alone, telling your superiors that the system is broken, and demanding it be fixed before more lives are lost. By the time the Cold War began, the lessons of Lockwood's crusade had shaped a new generation of sailors and scientists. The submarine force that once fired broken torpedoes now carried nuclear deterrence beneath the sea. Silent, invisible, and reliable to the last detail. Each captain, before taking command, learned the story of the man who refused to accept good enough. Because in the heart of every submarine crew, beneath the sonar hum and the recycled air and still lives the memory of the day when America's deadliest weapon failed, and one mad admiral refused to let it happen again. The legacy was no longer in the hardware. It was in the mindset, the belief that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is the foundation of every victory. The ocean never forgets. It holds its secrets in silence, wrecks, memories, and lessons that the surface world too often ignores. Beneath the blue vastness of the Pacific, the broken hulls of submarines still rest like quiet monuments to one of the greatest crises in American naval history. The story of the Mark 14 torpedo is not just the tale of a faulty weapon. It is the story of human nature, of pride, of denial, of courage, and of one man's refusal to accept comfortable lies in the face of terrible truth. Every war begins with confidence. Nations build their weapons, their strategies, and their myths upon the illusion of perfection. But history has always punished that illusion. The Mark 14 was born in peacetime in a lab shielded from reality. It was a triumph of theory, a marvel on paper, until the first real war exposed what the tests had hidden. For 2 years, American submariners fired torpedoes that refused to kill. They watched perfect shots fail, saw opportunities vanish, and endured the silent doubt that perhaps they were the problem. It was not just a mechanical failure. It was a human one. A failure of honesty, of oversight, of humility. Lockwood's investigation was never about one machine. It was about restoring truth to a system that had forgotten how to question itself. He forced the Navy to confront its own blindness, and that confrontation reshaped the very meaning of command. In times of crisis, loyalty becomes a weapon. Obedience is prized, dissent is punished, and silence becomes safety. But Lockwood understood that silence, in the face of a lie, was the most dangerous form of loyalty. He disobeyed not to rebel, but to protect. He challenged the system not out of arrogance, but out of duty, because he knew that truth, once buried, eventually takes its revenge in lives lost and missions failed. That lesson remains timeless. From the Pacific's depths to the corridors of modern institutions, the Mark 14 story reminds us that the price of avoiding truth is always paid in the currency of suffering. There is a cruel irony in war. The same species capable of building instruments of death must also summon the compassion to question their purpose. The torpedo crisis revealed both sides of that equation, the brilliance of invention and the blindness of bureaucracy. Machines do not fail alone. They fail with the people who design them, the people who trust them, and the people who refuse to admit their flaws. Lockwood's courage was not in fighting battles, but in demanding that truth itself be treated as a weapon of war, one that must always be sharpened, never dulled by ego or hierarchy. His legacy endures not in the steel of submarines, but in the principles of testing, verification, and accountability that now define modern military engineering. Every piece of technology humanity builds carries the same warning carved into its history. Progress is not the elimination of error, it is the recognition of it. The Mark 14 torpedo was an engineering marvel that killed too late to be called a success. Yet its failure became a foundation for every success that followed. Its flaws forced a generation of engineers to rethink everything about how weapons were tested, trusted, and deployed. And beneath that technical revolution lay a human revelation that progress is not driven by those who obey, but by those who dare to ask why. When modern naval officers study Lockwood's life, they find no heroic speeches or cinematic battles. What they find instead is something quieter, a model of integrity that refuses to bend under pressure. True leadership, Lockwood showed, is not about authority. It is about accountability. It is the strength to face uncomfortable truths, to risk your career for what is right, and to put reality above reputation. In that sense, his madness was nothing more than moral clarity. And history has a habit of proving that such madness is the only kind worth having. 70, 80 years later, the Pacific remains the same. Calm, vast, eternal. Beneath its waves lie submarines that never returned home, their decks coated in coral, their names fading with time. But their story has not faded, because in every sonar ping, in every quiet hum of a modern submarine reactor, their presence endures. They are reminders of a time when machines betrayed men, and one man refused to let that betrayal be buried. If history could speak, it would whisper through those currents. Test what you trust. Question what you're told. Seek truth before it seeks you. In the end, the Mark 14 torpedo did more than fail. It transformed. It became a lesson written into the DNA of American warfare, a silent teacher carried forward by generations of sailors, engineers, and leaders. And Admiral Charles Lockwood, the man once dismissed as stubborn, reckless, even insubordinate, became proof that one determined conscience can correct the course of an entire institution. Because the greatest victories in war are not always won with weapons. Some are won with truth. The Pacific still whispers his story. The currents still roll over the wrecks that mark the price of pride. And somewhere, in that endless blue, the spirit of one mad admiral endures, reminding the world that even in war, integrity is the sharpest weapon of all.